Now, I did want to give y'all a little bit further direction on this 2-page summary of conclusions that I'm asking you to write. Really, the point of the synthesis matrix is that it's meant to be an organizational tool that flows into a larger research paper or research project. Now, I don't want to make you write an entire paper or do an entire research presentation for this class. I think that's a little excessive, but I do want you to get the experience of actually making use of that synthesis matrix, because I think that might make the synthesis matrix make a little bit more sense if you actually see how it would roll into another project. So there's a few things that I'm going to be asking you to write about here, but I don't want you to spend an excessive amount of time on it or to worry about it too much. The first thing that I'm going to be asking you to do is just to write your research question at the top of the paper, so you don't have to go back and look for it. Now, the next piece is going to be a little bit larger than that. I'm going to want you to draw some conclusions based on the literature and the scholarship that you found when you were doing your research. Now, keep in mind, not every research question is going to have a definitive answer. It's actually pretty common for folks not to necessarily answer their research question, but to kind of end up in some weird gray area. So that's totally normal and fine. I want you to draw conclusions that are reasonable based on the evidence that you were able to find. Now, you might end up using your key themes from your synthesis matrix to help you kind of organize your conclusions. And that was sort of one of the main ideas of having that synthesis matrix, was that you would have kind of all your evidence lined up in a row on your synthesis matrix for your various themes. Now, your themes don't have to necessarily translate into conclusions, but they could, depending on how you organized your synthesis matrix. I don't really want you to quote heavily in this section. This is really meant to be more of an overall summary of the research that you found, but I would like you to include in-text citations when you're making your conclusions. Ideally, each of your conclusions would be supported with more than one source, because the idea behind the synthesis matrix was to synthesize multiple sources together. It's really meant for you to be able to show, hey, these 2 or 3 sources supported this particular conclusion, and then provide in-text citations for those. I think ideally in this section, you would have 3 or 4 conclusions that you would be able to talk about. Again, they don't necessarily need to be definitive conclusions that answer your research question. It can just be a discussion of the major themes that you found in your research and what all the sources had to say about those themes. The next thing I want you to do is provide a critique of the overall scholarly conversation on your topic. Now, this critique section tends to be the one that trips people up the most. And I think sometimes that's because they don't fully kind of grasp what I'm really asking you to do here. So I'm going to try to explain it here in this video, and also hopefully well enough in the instructions. What I want you to critique is really the scholarly conversation as a whole. So I don't necessarily want you to critique individual sources, and I don't want you to critique how hard particular sources were to read or the kinds of trouble that you had in the databases finding sources. I really want it to be about the scholarly conversation on your particular research question. So I really want to hear about areas of consensus. In what ways did all of your scholars agree with one another? In what ways did they not have consensus, or was there disagreement? Did they have multiple perspectives on the issue? You might find that sometimes people agree, but they agree for different reasons, or they approach things from different points of view. And so that's really what I want you to look at in this particular section. So point those out. I'm also interested in whether or not there were any kind of holes or gaps in the research that you found. Now, again, this isn't necessarily like, oh, I didn't look in this particular area when I was researching. It's a question of whether or not that's been researched yet. So, for example, if you were researching the effectiveness of the HPV vaccine, one thing that you might say that's a limitation of that research area is that the vaccine's really only been around for about 15 years. So in terms of really long-term impact of the vaccine, there haven't been any studies that have been done yet. Or if you were researching concussions in athletes, you might point out that most of the research that's been done has been done on men, and there's been less research done on the impacts of concussions in women. I'd also encourage you to make note of anything that you found particularly interesting or noteworthy or even a bit odd. Back when I was doing my midwife research, I tended to find that the midwife journals were very pro-midwife, and the journals that were primarily written by obstetricians and medical degree doctors were a little bit more conservative about whether using a midwife was a very good idea. Another thing I found interesting was that the definition of a midwife really varied in the literature, and so I might even call that a limitation, where not everybody was really using the same definition, whether they meant a certified nurse midwife or if they meant just like a lay midwife. You know, the medical risk factors based on who you're seeing and where you're seeing them, whether it's a home birth or a hospital birth, birth. All that kind of stuff really plays a large part when it comes to safety. And so if my research question was about the benefits and risks of using a midwife, all of them using different definitions really does impact the quality of the research that I'm able to find and the conclusions that I'm able to draw. So whatever that is for your research question, I mean, I know that my examples there were very specific and kind of odd, but I imagine most of you have something kind of like that in the research that you conducted, things that are just kind of a little odd and make it kind of difficult to draw conclusions. That's basically what I want you to point out here. The last thing that I want you to do is include future areas of research. So this is going to be just questions that came out of the research that you conducted. So remember when we talked about research as inquiry, we talked about how research can be a cyclical process, and that the research questions that you developed at the beginning might in turn beget new research questions as you research more. And so that's really what I want you to focus on in this section, is coming up with at least 2 new research questions that you would pursue in light of the research that you did for this class. I don't need you to include a bibliography. They're going to be in your synthesis matrix. You're going to turn in both of those documents at the same time. However, I would like you to include in-text citations in your conclusions, in your critique, wherever appropriate. And I linked to the MLA and APA guides for in-text citations there. I've also got a grade breakdown below. If you have any questions as you are completing this assignment, please do not hesitate to send me an email.